I'm Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm happy to welcome you to our program. I want to briefly explain that this is a truly hybrid event in that we have one panelist in the room and then two panelists joining us virtually, as well as guests in the room and many, many guests online. So we're experimenting with the wonders of modern technology. Before we get started, I want to thank our co-sponsor, the History Project. This is the second year we have partnered with them for a program exploring LGBTQ history, and we appreciate all the time and effort they've put into these events. I also want to thank the great team of people that we had who worked on this program and planning it and all the time and energy that they put into it. If anyone is joining MHS for the first time, let me mention that we are the first historical society in America. We were founded in 1791, and for the past 230 years, we have been a resource for researchers and the public. Today, we maintain a library, we have galleries open to the public, and we host a wide variety of programs. Some of these programs are for academic audiences, and some are oriented towards the public. We're only able to produce these programs thanks to the support of our members, and we hope that you'll check out our calendar and come back for future events. We also hope if you enjoy attending programs at MHS that you will consider becoming a member or making a donation. Tonight we have a great discussion that will explore the process of writing history, specifically the unique challenges posed to those who research queer history in archives. A person's sexual life or desires may not be included in the records they pass on. It's also certainly possible that descendants of members of the LGBTQ plus community may have censored or destroyed some records. So this evening we'll discuss the work of creating inclusive and accurate history in the face of these issues. We're joined by a great group. I'll give very brief introductions. So here with me at MHS is Trip Evans. He is a professor of art history at Wheaton College. His research focuses on the material culture of the late 19th and early 20th century in American art and architecture. He received his BA in architectural history from the University of Virginia and his MA and PhD in the history of art from Yale University. His current research focuses on the role of the American House Museum as seen through 4 historic homes located in New England. Joining us via Zoom are Heather White. She's a visiting assistant professor of religion and gender and queer studies at the Harvard Divinity School and a women's studies and religion program research associate for 2021-2022. She received her BA from Eastern University and her MDiv and PhD from Princeton University. Her current research looks at the unexpected alliance formed following the 1969 Stonewall riots between queer activists and the Church of the Holy Apostles in New York. And then Jen Mannion is a professor of history and sexuality, women's and gender studies at Amherst College. Professor Mannion received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and her MA and PhD from Rutgers University. Her research in American history centers on social and cultural histories of poor, marginalized, and otherwise ordinary people. So I think this is a wonderful group, and I thank you all for joining us, both virtually and in person. So we're going to start off with just each of our panelists giving a very brief description of their research. So since I started with Trip, I guess we can start with you.
Great. Just very briefly, the 2 projects that really sort of bring me to this topic are the biography that I wrote in 2010 of the painter Grant Wood. Many of you all may know his American Gothic, the pitchfork-wielding farmer and his wife. It was the first biography written of Wood since his death in 1941, and also the first sustained piece of writing to address his sexuality. So it was both a great joy and kind of a challenge to put that together. The work that I'm currently writing is a study of 4 case studies of historic house museums, all of them created either in their entirety or in their final stage by gay men. And they're all in New England. And so my archival work there has been in a variety of different places. Historic New England, which owns 2 of the houses, Gibson House Museum Archives, and the RISD Museum in Providence, which is the other. So I've got a real range of experiences with those.
Great, thank you. So Heather, you're next to us on the Zoom screen, so I guess you're next.
All right. Hello. I'm excited to be with you all tonight. Heather White, and my current project, as already mentioned, is focusing on the Church of the Holy Apostles, which is an Episcopal congregation in New York City that provided space for most of the organizations that were growing and starting after the 1969 Stonewall riots. But I got into that project through my previous project, which is out as a book, Reforming Sodom, Protestants and the Rise of Gay Rights. And that looks at mainline Protestant churches, which are the historically oldest Protestant denominations in the US, mostly predominantly white, and they tend to be a little bit more liberal leaning than many other Protestant congregations. And it traced their formative influences both on discourses about religion and homosexuality in the US in the 20th century, and also their surprising role, many of them as advocates and allies of LGBT movements as they were first emerging. So my work really looks at religion and looks at how to rethink religion and the history of sexuality.
Jen?
Hi, so happy to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming. My training is in history, really the history of women, gender, and sexuality with a focus on early America. So my first project wasn't very queer. I focused on the first penitentiary in the US, which was basically 1780s to 1830s. And I did an intersectional analysis that centered the experiences of women. And those records don't have much to say about, queer and trans lives, with the exception of sodomy. So when men are charged and convicted of sodomy, and that's something that happens to men and not women in this era. And so one of the main frameworks for all of my work in this period is really the invisibility and erasure of queerness, and trying to figure out how to understand our lives or these systems in the absence of records. My next book, really, I just decided to jump right into super queer sources so that I could have some fun unpacking things that my first project denied me. And really what you see right away is gender expression is everywhere. The 19th, 18th, and 19th century newspapers, court records, there's a lot more references to people cross-dressing and challenging gender norms. And it's much easier to find those kinds of references and try to figure out what they mean than it is to find references to someone's interior, someone's inner life, someone's, romantic or sexual feelings or desires. For so many reasons, they're not as well recorded or preserved in the record. And so focusing on gender expression led me to the book Female Husbands, which is where I'll end up drawing, most of my anecdotes from this evening.
Great. Thank you very much. So we have a series of questions. I think that we all sort of realize that not all of these questions are going to fit every panelist exactly. So everyone is welcome to jump in, and our panelists are, of course, it's great if you want to ask other panelists questions or follow up on something that somebody said. So feel free to express your own questions if you'd like to. So we had a question was just, do you have any stories of being surprised by something that was really useful that you found in the archives? And or do you have any funny stories about doing archival research? And Heather, in our earlier planning session, I know that you had mentioned that you had some, so I'm going to just toss this to you first, and then Tripp and Jen, you can jump in depending on if you have stories or not.
Sure. And I had trouble figuring out which story to focus on. I think one of the benefits of working on 20th and in some cases early 20th century sources is, you have to talk to people to work out some of the access questions to my sources. So I have had to have conversations with churches about how to access records that are often located in really strange and unexpected and sort of unknown to those congregations' spaces. So there was a group of church records that we were able to find, by working with a former rector of the Church of the Holy Apostles, who was, at the age that he was, which was not a young chicken, climbing up into the attic over the belfry and bringing down boxes for me to look at one evening. So those were some surprising records to be able to access, and it's been an amazing resource that has helped me understand a lot of what was happening in that church. And a lot of that has helped me find out about how much that congregation was involved well before anyone realized in some of that early gay rights, gay liberation, even organizing. So being able to access those records and being able to even find them was both a surprise and also really exciting.
So Trip or Jen, did you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great kind of advantages of the project I'm working on right now is that there's such a variety of different kinds of archives that I'm working in that sometimes what I can't find in one, I can find in another. I specifically chose these 4 case studies from the same, sort of New England, kind of milieu, knowing that there might be some kind of overlapping in their interactions. And when I was doing my work at the Gibson House Archives, there's almost, nothing, very little about Gibson's personal life, and certainly not about the kind of love of his life that has sort of come down to us. The Count de Moni, we had this sort of affair with in the 1890s. There's nothing about this in the Gibson House Archives. Nothing of it was saved, and that's largely probably due to Charlie himself not including this in his papers. When I went to Historic New England to investigate Ogden Codman, who was a sort of rough contemporary of his, suddenly in going through his papers, I find all of these references to the Gibson de Moni scandal. And it was this perfect lesson to me of course, that would be in the Codman archive and not in the Gibson archive, because Codman had no skin in the game. For Codman just thought it was this titillating story that he could tell. And therefore, it did remain preserved in his papers in the way that it would not have in Gibson's. And it was a great lesson to me of, if you're not finding what you're looking for, look where the light is brighter, and maybe you'll find it.
Right. Great. Jen, did you want to pipe in, or should we go on to another question?
Yeah, I'd love to tell a quick little story. I'm from St. Clair, Pennsylvania, and some of you might be familiar with it because it's the title of a book that Anthony F.C. Wallace wrote decades ago about the coal region of Pennsylvania. And so for me, I found a reference to 2 different female husbands in the local, it was called the Pottsville Miners Journal. Which was a Whig paper that catered to, coal barons and was very, very anti-Irish. And so in 1838, they actually ran a full story reprinted from the Manchester Guardian about one of my female husbands, who, Henry Stoke, who plays a really significant role in my book, and then another shorter piece in the 1850s. And so for me, to see that some newspaper in the town where I grew up, where I didn't read anything about anybody queer or gay in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, was reprinting, accounts of these queer marriages and people who had transgender, in England from hundreds of years earlier, right? It just absolutely blew my mind. So it's like still, my favorite source related to female husbands.
Well, thank you all for all those stories. That's great. In a somewhat related question, we recently hosted a program with Robert Gross and a series of historians who are reflecting on the works of Robert Gross. in the beginning, when Bob was talking about his work, he said that as a young graduate student, he was trying to determine, he wanted to focus his studies on a specific town and do a deep dive into this town. And he was trying to figure out which town to look at. And he went to a advisor of his, and he said, I have this list of towns. And he rattled off a number of New England sites. And he said, I'm thinking about this town, and I'm thinking about that town, and I'm thinking about Concord, and I'm thinking about this. And the advisor just said, what's wrong with you? Why wouldn't you just look at Concord? I mean, this is like where the American Revolution started. It's the Transcendentalists. There's all this documentation on Concord. You know, what are you going to find in Acton that's going to rival Concord? No offense to Acton. And that just sort of reminded me that that people are attracted to where there are a lot of sources. If there's a great, multitude of sources, that's a great place to dive in. And so you end up going there. And with queer sources, they become much more readily available in the 20th century. So I'm going to imagine that there's a lot of work that's done on 20th century queer studies. But do you worry that this sort of makes earlier periods sort of overshadowed by the preponderance of 20th century work? Or do you think that it's an ongoing dialogue is being built up throughout the whole period? And I'm not sure who is the right person to toss this to. Heather, you're working in the 20th century, so that maybe is not you, but Jen or Tripp, I mean, you're talking about certainly 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I think, once I had chosen my set, I realized early on in the project that, my first chapter on Charles Pendleton, there's almost nothing about his biography, his personal life, anything. The next chapter is on Codman, and Codman, there's 100 linear feet of documents at Historic New England. They saved every grocery list. In those two cases, I was both overwhelmed by the Codman material, and I didn't quite know what to do with Pendleton. But what I've found with these earlier periods is that sometimes the absence becomes the story. And in earlier conversations about this, I was saying that, I say to my students sometimes that these queer absences in archives remind me of, those body casts in Pompeii where like the body is gone, but you can sort of fill the absence back in and recreate what is gone. And I think that that's true sometimes with these absences with earlier sources. If you find that someone's life is meticulously documented, but there's nothing about this one person that they had an affair with, that tells you a lot. And I think that you can begin to construct a different kind of narrative around those absences. So for me, I think earlier periods are happy hunting grounds. I think it's in some ways kind of more fun to attack a project that doesn't have an avalanche of material around it.
Fair enough. Jen or Heather, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in as somebody who has mostly dedicated their career to these, impossible to find sources. I think it's a really important question, and there's a lot of different ways to approach it. I think for me, when I was deciding to be a pre-20th century person, there's actually a ton of great books on queer histories of the 20th century. Most people focus on the post-45 era, and I felt like I could make a contribution by working in an earlier period where fewer people were working. And I loved early American history as a undergrad and as a grad student. So there already there's so much amazing important work that exists, but also isn't really as fully incorporated into US history surveys and the mainstream profession as it should be. So there's a lot of different forces that kind of shape how we do what we do. I think the other barrier is that archives and libraries until very recently haven't done enough to support and fund and catalog queer records, right? And especially it's been more well done for the post-Stonewall era, where there's an obvious movement and clear identity groups, but it's been much less well done by the institutions documenting 18th and 19th century records. And so, you know, we partly just need more help from librarians and archivists, you know, tagging and flagging and indexing and making those records visible to people. And then I would just say, finally, as someone, you know, whose most recent book was a fundamentally trans and queer book and ends right barely into the 20th century, it's so important. I get emails all the time from high school students, from college students, from people who are just like, oh my God, like, thank you so much for documenting some queer and trans experiences of an earlier era, because we're left feeling like people like us didn't exist before 1969. And that's kind of a shitty feeling, and it's really false. And it gives us a really warped perspective on, you know, the last 400 years of history.
Yeah.
So Heather, I don't know if you want to jump in or if we
I
want to
could. Yeah, and actually, I relate to the story that you tell about the Concord problem. Not so the way that that makes sense for my researchers, actually, because I have a New York problem, right? So I'm writing now about New York City, the gay movement in New York City in like the late 60s and early 70s. Everybody has written about Stonewall. I'm writing about Stonewall. So in many ways, this is the story that everybody tells. This is probably the most well-documented moment in LGBT history, and certainly one of the most well-known. So I'm writing about a church that served as a community center, and it would be really easy to see this as a New York exception, because New York always seems exceptional, and there's a cultural framework that if it happened in New York, it's because New York is so weird. So one of the things I'm really working on is making sure that it's clear in the writing that I'm doing that New York is not at all an exception in this case, that in most places in the US, so that includes where I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. It includes Seattle, which is not far from where I live now, but in small towns and, flyover country and coastal cities, like almost everywhere, a church was the first effective gay community center, the places where these LGBT groups were starting to meet at the point where they outgrew people's living rooms and were public enough to be able to need a larger space, but didn't have a budget yet to be able to afford it. And in most cases, it was a church that was hosting different groups that were coming through and getting started. And that part of LGBT history has been largely overlooked, even when historians and activists are aware of it happening in their own city. And Boston is a really good example. I've looked at some of the archival records from, again, the same period of time, from the mid to late 60s through the early 70s, again, just as these groups were getting large enough to need a public space. And there were several churches that were providing meeting spaces, and activists and organizers in Boston thought Boston was so weird. It must be because we're a church city that this is the place where, churches seem to be unusually receptive to having gay groups meet in their space. And that you can trace that kind of perspective in Chicago. In all these places are like, well, we're this local exception where religious groups are so unexpectedly hospitable. And people, I think there's a reason why that perception existed, right? The perception was that religion historically had been hostile. And that's where we certainly do need more research into the deeper and the further past to be able to see the complexity there, because that also means that there's a narrative about what religion is like almost uniformly across history that makes it hard to even recognize patterns in the present. So that's one thing that I've been really working to do, in addition to focusing in New York, where the sources are rich, and so well documented to make sure that there's also places where I can show that this was not an exception, that it was happening really almost everywhere.
Great. So I'm going to sort of follow up a little bit on something that Jen said when discussing what archives can do moving forward. And she mentioned, flagging, tagging, and indexing terms. And this reminds me a little bit of a recent award selection process that I was a part of for the American Association for State and Local History. And one of the projects that was submitted for an award, which I thought was really exceptional, was a exhibition mounted by the Washington State Historical Society in Tacoma, Washington, that was titled Crossing Boundaries. And it was portraits of the transgendered West from 1860 to 1940. And in their narrative discussing this project, they talked about how they had a lot of issues with understanding how to contextualize the language that was used. So the language that the people in the past were using was very different than the terms that we would use today. And some of the language that they used then would be offensive today, but it was used by people who were members of the LGBTQ community to describe themselves. And it was this issue of how do you give these people from the past the ability to have their own voice while making it understandable to a person today. And so I just wanted to ask, in your research, have you experienced challenges in presenting the voices of people in the past that will make sense to people today and will be sort of digestible to people today?
Yeah,
scrolled over
to.
I think the camera picked you.
It's something that I struggle with a lot in my writing, in my titles, and explaining my work to people. Dealing with, in my current project, 4 men who lived in the late 19th and early 20th century. They would not have identified themselves as gay. They would not have identified themselves as queer. I'm resistant to using the term homosexual as a sort of clinical, sort of scientific term in these circumstances. For these guys, I settled on bachelor with a big asterisk of sort of explaining what that kind of meant to the period. But what has been helpful to me, at least in the work that I've been doing, whether the Grant Wood biography or the current project, is to focus a little bit less on terms and more on trying to locate desire and locate relationship affinities. For me as an art historian, one of the ways I can do that is through imagery. And I feel like it's a fully legitimate way to sort of think about someone expressing desire or, longing. I think that is also a through line that you can bring throughout history, regardless of terminology. People of the same sex have desired and slept with one another since the dawn of time. And that notion of thinking about desire and romantic affinities has been a way for me to, in some ways, put the debate about terminology to one side. It's not that I avoid it, but you're right, it is a real challenge because we are talking about communities and people who you don't want to project 20th or 21st century notions of identity onto them, and yet you also want to claim your family. You want to bring them back in. And for me, the best way to do that has been to talk about relationships and desire, however you're able to sort of document that.
Jen or Heather, do you want to jump in on this at all?
Yeah, I'm happy. I feel like this is it's the core conflict in the field. It can be really generative, and then it can also just be like a huge speed bump slash, wall. And I think the stakes are really high for people because we have so little queer and trans history. And so I would say with my most recent book, I wrote a book about female husbands. That's who they were. That was the term by which they were described. Now, I was criticized for erasing lesbian history by people who were really invested in the idea that these people were really lesbians and they only transgender and lived as men so that they could be with women because the world was so homophobic at that time. That could be true. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, because there's so little history and so little evidence, like, some people just felt like I pulled these people over into this realm of a trans experience, like saying, well, what they really did was transgender. So let's see what we could learn about their lives if we considered the role of gender in their lives, but that felt really bad, for a group of people who are like desperate to have lesbians in history. And so it's just like a huge challenge. And I think I personally just kind of go back and forth between, our training about being historically precise and specific and understanding the context of, how gender and sexuality functioned in the time and place that we're studying. And I think that's so interesting, and I've fallen in love with it. And that's why I do work in the early period. And then at the same time, it is frustrating, it's alienating. If we think about other minority groups who have histories, no group has this kind of rupture the way we do. Like, African American history is an amazing, rich, robust field, regardless of the terminology that individual African American people and communities use to describe themselves in a given era, right? It's still part of a whole. Same thing for workers, right? So workers, laborers, like there are other kinds of historical work for whom it's not like a problem. And I think the worst part to me is that it's more of a problem for people assigned female at birth /women /lesbians than it is for gay men, who some ways have a more stable trans historical identity. And sometimes I feel like our terminology challenges are a cop-out for people who don't really want to think about or deal with queer and trans history at all. And so it's just like, well, that they didn't exist until the 1950s, so don't worry about it.
So Heather, did you want to pipe in, or?
Well, I was going to say, even in looking at the recent past and trying to figure out how to, what kinds of identity labels to use in describing the 1960s and 70s, right? When I'm talking about the gay movement, which was internally diverse, so many different ways of naming the identity groups within that. And yet gay was the umbrella term that was the new movement label, right? Even figuring out how to translate that context to 50 years later, which isn't a lot of past to transcend, right? But even that is a challenge, to make sure that I do that well, and to do that so that my audiences who are attuned to different ways of listening are able to hear the nuances of the identities that I'm finding in the historical record. And yet also, and folks who are still alive today could say, like, this is who I am. That's the other part of it. And to make sure that I'm also paying attention to what's happening within movements. So I do think that the work to recover and highlight trans histories in that recent past, like the work of Susan Stryker and others, has been so important for recovering how much of that gender identity history was part of that earlier moment, but has not been really foregrounded in the dominantly sexual orientation focused histories that have been told about Stonewall, that have been told about the 60s and 70s and during that moment in LGBT history. So finding ways to do that pay attention, as Jen said, to the labels that were used by the folks who were part of that history, and also to be able to speak to audiences who have triggers, right, around what we can hear and what we respond to. Because I had a student one time ask if, man, are there any queer identity labels that are not slurs? Right. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the question gets asked as, are there any queer identity labels that are not slurs? Right. just speaks to exactly the problem of recovering identity language that is always already burdened by stigma, even in the names that are there to be able to use to describe those identities.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions for each individual panelist, and then I think we want to make sure that we leave some time for questions from the audience and questions from people online. So in sort of a random order, Jen, one thing that we were thinking about was, being at MHS, we're sort of very aware of people like John Adams and John Quincy Adams, people who, John Quincy Adams is sort of a great example. Like John Quincy Adams, from the moment of his birth, knew that his life was significant and that he needed to document his life. And he kept a daily diary for the vast majority of his life. If you want to know something about John Quincy Adams, it's there. It's documented. It's not, there's no digging for it. But a lot of your work has been on documenting more marginalized people, both people who have maybe been uncomfortable in terms of the expression of their identity, but also people who are poor or just weren't focused on. And how have you worked to give these people voices when there may not be writing in their own voice? Like, how can you have their narrative presented in their own way? It's not well phrased, but.
Well, yeah, I appreciate the question. I think I've done, significant work at MHS and I love it. And, lots of some of the other archives with similar collections. And I think, what I ended up doing is, the people who I end up studying are usually not represented in those kinds of collections. And so for my first book, I'm at a city archives reading through court dockets. It's kind of the court dockets and prison records are at the heart of my work on incarcerated women. And so they're in, state and city, archives. And then for female husbands, they're mostly from newspapers. So they don't even they're not even, none of these people are having the opportunity or access to record diaries if they could even read and write. And if they could, not of the mind that their thoughts or their daily activities matter. And if they did, not of the station in which, those record books were preserved. To get to a place like an MHS or some other archive. So I think like Tripp said earlier about, paying attention to the silences and the gaps is just as important to us as historians in formulating projects and, pursuing projects as the records that are there. And so those gaps, I think for me, for 15 years, of feeling frustrated about those gaps led me to say, I'm just going to zero in right here where I know there are actual records of some queer and trans people who deserve to have their history uplifted. And so I don't know that I've given them a voice or given anyone a voice, but I think I've put some people into the record books, who haven't had access to that.
Well, thank you very much. So Heather, your work deals with both religion and sexuality, both of which are very complicated topics, and both of which are topics that can be very definitional for people, are very fundamental to a person's identity. Have you found ways that these two things interact in ways that are surprising? For example, a conservative religious leader who is much more open to queer culture based on an understanding of religious meaning, or are there ways in which these streams have crossed that have been surprising for you?
It's a really interesting question. The surprises, I think I'll say, well, the conservative religious leader, the primary example of that is Troy Perry, who grew up Pentecostal in Northern Florida, white, conservative growing up, was first ordained in a Pentecostal denomination, served in the military, sort of came out in Los Angeles. And the story of the founding of the Metropolitan Community Church, as I found myself even in writing about it historically to be really caught up by the way the history of that denomination, which was founded by Troy Perry, in many ways relies on so much like teasing out history from a kind of commemorative narrative that is, it's hard to Troy, as Troy Perry tells it, the voice of God spoke to him and told him to found a church, right? Like, I'm not going to find historical documentation of that voice, right? And yet, like, this is the important moment for Troy Perry. And so writing that as a, I guess, taking seriously religious experience and taking seriously that kind of transcendental experience or transcendent experience as something that can affect important historical changes and affect movement growth has been part of what I was working to think about and take seriously in my work, which also, means taking really seriously the way that congregations and individuals are moved by their beliefs about God, their beliefs about what the Bible says, and as a way of paying attention to that sort of force of change as important to histories that have been often framed as entirely secular, right? As really not about religion, because religion is about something else. It's more conservative, and like, who knows what these people thought when they say God was talking to them, right? But to do that has been a surprising and interesting way to go about thinking about what religion is as and how to write about it historically, right? Historical writing draws in itself from traditions of Protestant narratives, right? We could go back to Pilgrim's Progress and all kinds of things that have influenced sort of chronologies of history and ways of writing experience. And so working on doing that in a way that is also attending to religious experience in recent history has been one of the more interesting and challenging parts of my questions about how to write what I'm writing about the folks that are a part of the history that I've been researching. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. So Trip, in your work exploring house museums in New England, have you found resistance to including sexuality as the part of the interpretation of the space? So are there small house museums all across the country, and while there are some that are amazingly progressive, many present a very idealized picture of domesticity that removes any personal drama from the presentation. Have you found that more nuanced discussion is upsetting to some, or are people welcoming of this conversation?
Well, I can't speak for the the broad range of the hundreds, probably thousands of historic house museums in this country. I leave that to Ken Torino, who's here with us, and Sue Ferentinos and others who've studied this much more broadly. But fundamentally, historic house museums that are centered on an individual are a form of biography. People come and they expect biography when they come. And so I guess I want to sort of attack this from my own experience as a biographer. When I wrote the Grant Wood biography, there were some in Iowa, his home state, who were really not particularly happy with the biography that I had written. And in fact, the biography was banned in a way that you can, to the extent you can ban anything in the digital age, in his hometown of Anamosa, where I made the choice to still give a book lecture in. And when I lectured there, the first question I got from someone in Anamosa was a guy who stood up and he said, "What we would like to know," meaning the community of Anamosa, "is why you felt you had to go into his personal life." And I took a deep breath and I said, It is a biography. And that's what biographers do. So I would say house museums are biographies, and that's what biographies do. And so, this resistance, and I know that there is resistance in some places to interpreting, the kind of queer lives of historic figures. I think the resistance comes from that same place of, we want to know this about their life, but we don't want to know this about their life. And I think the real importance of the work that people are doing, like in the houses that I'm working on, Martha Van Koevering at Beauport has done amazing work around Henry Davis Sleeper and the kind of reintroduction of him, a reintegration of him, I should say, as a gay man. Megan Gilardi Holmes at the Gibson House Museum has done extraordinary work, especially around kind of pride programming, bringing Charlie Gibson's kind of full life, kind of back to the house. And I think in those cases, what is extraordinary about that, and Jen has touched on this, is that in particular, sort of young people come into these houses and think, thank God, finally, someone, before, 1970, we can actually sort of look to and think about as an ancestor figure. And it doesn't mean that these efforts necessarily always center the sexuality of the figures. It's just a reintegration, I feel like, of their full human selves, so that you get a better sense of their struggles, of their communities, and kind of who they were. And I don't think it does anyone any service to say, we'll tell this part of the life, but we won't tell this part of the life, because without reintegrating these, we'll never understand these sites.
Well, thank you very much. And I wanted to, before we open it up to questions from the audience and to the people online, I wanted to ask if Heather or Jen or Trip, if you had questions for the other panelists that you wanted to ask. And if you don't, that's fine, because I didn't actually tell you to do this beforehand. But I just did want to make that an option if people had a question. Or?
Well, I would like to just say to Heather, thank you for the something I'd never thought about before, which is the central role of churches in LGBT activism. I am not a churchgoer, but you suddenly made me realize that in all of the first meetings around marriage equality activism in Providence, we always met in church basements. And I, the non-churchgoer, was sitting in these Unitarian church basements thinking, this is never going to happen. But without that space and without that support, that's where it got started, and it turned into something else. But that's where it began. So thank you for making me remember that. Thanks
for that, Trip. And I'll say that response or that memory, I've had so many conversations with. And I'll also say that. Queer movements are not an exception here either, but often I think there's less surprise to hear that civil rights movements met in churches. We know that, right? Even Black Lives Matter activism is happening often in churches as meeting spaces, but to realize that queer movements are doing that as well and continue to be doing that is a different way of thinking about how religion is important in politics, because so much of the air and the dominant narrative focuses on one kind of religious group and one kind of involvement. And this important way of being involved often isn't as visible. So thank you.
So do we have questions from the audience? And I know that there's a couple of questions online, but does anyone in the room? What? Oh, wait, we can give you a microphone. Oh, it's Jim Shea.
Trip, I want to ask you your research efforts, and how do you find, because most archives are not cataloged by queer people. If they do, they don't say these are queer people. So getting at these people, on these unknown stories, how do you, Codman's well known in Sleeper, but there's lots of people in Boston, Cambridge, where I live, that I know about, but you don't know about them until you get into their papers and understand their community. It's really a lot of work. And how do you, how are you finding different archives and their accessibility and how you find these people through the finding aids? Unless you talk to an archivist who knows, yeah, he was a queer man.
Sometimes it is just like that story of Gibson and Codman. Sometimes it is just a happy accident that you find that intersection that suddenly the light comes on. Some of it involves having to have a little bit of a sense of what you're looking for before you go in, because going in blindly, I would not necessarily have found what I needed for some of these folks. But, you know, when I was talking about, you know, that notion of looking at desire as opposed to looking at, you know, the letter where you hear an affair sort of, you know, take place, one of the ways in which I think any researcher in an archive needs to be attentive to are the codes in which the subjects themselves are cloaking things. Because the biggest censor for all queer archives are almost always like the subjects themselves. It's like that stuff is often cleaned out before it ever makes it into an archive. But a good example of the way in which you can, I think, begin to start, you know, cracking these codes and sort of thinking about desire is, I'll give you one example. Henry Davis Sleeper was sort of head over heels, you know, kind of in love with his neighbor, Pied Andrew. He never would have written that in a letter. There's no document that's going to tell that story, but you come to find out that they referred to one another by their houses' names. And so the last thing, it chokes me up to even like every time I think about this story, the last thing that Sleeper ever wrote to Andrew on his deathbed was, "You will never know what your house has meant to me." And you know, you learn these codes, and you have to learn the language. It's not, you know, I wish it were as easy as saying go to this finding aid. You've got to learn a kind of language of desire.
Olivia, do we have a question or two from people online?
Milo is a historical fiction writer, and is writing about a trans experience and is having trouble getting their book to be accepted because the people in the publishing industry don't see this history of trans people. So is wondering if you have advice for authors or with your books, if you've have any advice to give to people trying to get this out here, this history out there.
I'm happy to jump in on this. You know, I was reading the question, thinking about it. I don't know about the query letter. I think the field is still so new, like the historical research, that there is usually a 10 to 20 year lag time before it really like permeates consciousness and, you know, will shift, except that, of course, there is so much awareness about trans people and activism and lives and curiosity. And my only concrete thought was, you know, to reach out to two people who have had great success. And that is Jordy Rosenberg and Alex Meyers, right? So those are just two crossover works of historical fiction that are also, you know, really grounded in archival research, but that were fiction that got a lot of mainstream success. So I just think, you know, they might have better advice for you than I would. And there are also two great examples of there being a real appetite for this.
Got a question from Michael, who asks, when looking at records that lack a personal account, such as newspapers or court records, how do you balance the institutional narrative with a historical subject's own agency or experience?
Sounds like it's for Jen.
Well, I'll jump on it first and just say it's impossible. It's devastating. It's the hardest part of the work. And I think, you know, really the people, scholars in African American history are pioneering I'm just thinking Cydia Hartman, of course, off the top of my head, and other historians of slavery who were really pushing the envelope on this, saying we have to be more imaginative to create possible stories for people's agencies and feelings and desires when we don't have the records. Like, because I definitely tried to do a little bit more of that in Female Husbands than I did in my first book, but it's really hard. We're trained not to ever make anything up, but that definitely leaves us lacking in this area of really ever bringing someone's story to life. And I do think that's something that we have to do, figure out how to do more of and do it better, because we deserve it as readers. The people who are writing about deserve it, and I think Tripp and Heather have done a much better job of this, so I'll stop.
Heather or Tripp, did you have anything that you wanted to jump in on this, or?
The stuff that I look at is so deeply personal. It's not like I'm looking at newspaper accounts or court records, that kind of stuff. It may be oblique, but it's still pretty personal. Letters and other people's sort of memoirs and things. But Jen, you're reminding me of the work that say like Annette Gordon-Reed did around Sally Hemings, in which in the absence of any real sense of what her day-to-day feelings were like, or what her inner life was like, there are moments at which she talks about Martha Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who were traveling in the same circles in Paris in the 1790s, and thinking about these two young women and how might their experiences have reflected one another. And that kind of history writing really kind of blew me away, because she was able to kind of resurrect for us an imagination around Sally Hemings' life in the absence of any sense of what her inner life was. And I felt it very convincing, even though she says, I can't fill in the whole picture. I can give you a little bit of a sense of, who was around her at the time.
We really need to work on our clock. It's also fast, so just tell me. But did you have a question?
Oh, I would say I would. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Heather, were you?
I would just jump in about the one thing about telling experience is, even if we don't have access to the interior life, being able to describe spaces around, like what would that person have seen? What would the street have looked like? What would the building, what would the room? And finding sources that access that, newspapers are really helpful, are really good in bringing something to life, even when you don't know what someone would have been feeling. But let me hop out because there's a question.
So we've been reading 19th century letters recently, and there's a lot of endearment in 19th century writing. And so how do you think about those in light of somebody that you suspect is probably gay, a man? And is it just through the quantity of how often they make endearments to another person?
Sometimes I feel like it's just like a gut reaction that you have to these documents. I think sometimes you kind of, and this is probably a very non-historical way of putting it, but it's sort of, sometimes when you come across an incredibly intimate letter between two people, it will just hit you right in the solar plexus, like what is being exchanged between these two people. Whether or not that is necessarily sexual or romantic, it is I think often a real marker of that there's something more to it than there was. For example, I read a great letter that of all people, Isabella Stewart Gardner wrote to a female friend of hers who sent her flowers. And she said, "Your flowers touched me so much that I sat in my courtyard with them in my lap, touching them as I wept and thought of you." And I thought, that's a really serious friendship. That is an intimacy. But between folks who there is a kind of an established kind of history of a relationship, I think it's not as hard to figure out, how codes of meaning or forms of address can be investigated. And you know what? Another really great, and I'm an art historian, so again, this is sort of part of my training. I think an awful lot of information can also come to us through images and photographs. I think photographs often tell us things that letters cannot. And they do so often in informal ways. For example, the Historic New England has these extraordinary guest books for the House Red Roof that I was just referencing. And the images in there of the owner's interactions with his male guests are, an extraordinary visual document of something that seems to document something much beyond, sort of casual friendship. It's tough. I mean, it's you're never going to find the, kind of explicit. Codman gives us some fairly explicit things, but the thing with Codman is that he saved so much stuff that I fully believe that either because he believed his station as a Boston Brahmin kind of made him exempt from scrutiny, or because he was saving so damn much stuff that he thought nobody's ever going to find this letter. We did.
Heather or Jen, did you want to comment on this, or should we take one last question? Okay. Olivia, do you have one last question online? That's great. Or is there somebody else in the audience?
We have an anonymous question from an undergrad asking how, if you have advice for getting started in this research.
No, as an undergrad.
In getting started in what?
Like queer history research.
Yeah.
Queer history research. For me, I don't know how it is for you two, but it's really the compelling subject, a compelling life that you really want to know more about. For me, either as a biographer or as just an architectural historian who's interested in the lives of the folks who created these spaces, it always, at least for me, starts with a connection with a person. Heather and Jen, I don't know how it is for you all, or how you felt like you sort of dove into this stuff.
I mean, I think my first piece of advice would be so practical, and it would be to meet with a librarian. And
yes,
just right. Just because I think about the librarian who works with my students at the University of Puget Sound, and it's like magic tools all of a sudden become accessible to them. In many ways that is accurately what happens, because they find the specific places to look and jump in. And it's hard to imagine, it's hard to look for something that you don't know is even out there as a possibility. So in many ways, it's just getting started in a journey that will be serendipitous, because you will find things that you were not looking for. Yeah.
I guess I would just add, when I was an undergrad, I took a class, we did gay history for a day of the whole semester, I'm sure. But somebody told me about the Queer History Archive downtown, and I went there and volunteered. So you might live near somewhere that has an actual, archive, either a queer history archive or another kind of archive that has some queer holdings. And since then, the internet has been invented. So there's also a lot of sources online. There's just a ton, and of, a lot of I actually have a list of maybe the 10 biggest queer history archives on my website, which is just my name. And then, but they also have digital exhibits, and they have some of their holdings digitized. And if you're interested in transgender history, the DTA, the Digital Transgender Archive, is just a phenomenal resource. It's free, it's open access. So any entry point that most excites you, reading a book, talking to a librarian, going to the archives, anything that catches keeps you hooked is the best way.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for making time and being a part of our program. I want to be conscious of time because I think lots of people have dinner to still have. But thank you all for being great panelists, and thank you all for joining us both virtually and in person.